Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to spend your morning with us today. I'm Kelly Mitchell, and I'm the Executive Director of the Robina Institute of Criminal Law and Criminal Justice. And you're here attending the webinar, Disrupting the Probation to Incarceration Pathway, Translating Research into Action. We'll be talking today about an ongoing partnership that the Robina Institute has with Ramsey County Community Corrections to understand the drivers of probation revocation and to develop, to identify and implement ways to reduce revocations. The work that we're highlighting in the webinar today is generously supported by Arnold Ventures and by the CUNY Institute for State and Local Governance. This project has been especially salient for us at the Robina Institute because it really hits on two of the four pillars that define the way that we do our work. And those are developing unique policy solutions and connecting research to practice. The Robina Institute was founded with the goal of creating transformative change in the criminal justice system. And so we don't approach our work with preset solutions. Instead, in every place that we've done work, we go in, we do our best to try to understand how the criminal justice system is operating in that jurisdiction. And then we develop unique policy solutions that we think can work within the confines of that existing structure. And we don't do this work to write a report and put it on the shelf. Instead, we're looking for putting our research into action. That's our goal, both where we're working and more broadly. And so this webinar today is part of that effort to broadly disseminate our work. We're hoping that we can give you some information about how this project has worked in Ramsey County and maybe spark some ideas for you about how you could do similar work in your own jurisdiction. We're going to start this webinar by explaining what the project is and presenting some of the major findings from the research phase. And then after that, we'll turn to a discussion about solutions and implementation. But first, a couple of housekeeping things. Let's go to the next slide. We are going to reserve some time at the end for questions. So if you do have questions for any of the speakers today, please use your Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. It should look something like what you're seeing here. Click on that, put your questions in, and we'll get to as many of those as we can today. Next slide, please. If you're an attorney in Minnesota, we have applied for CLE credits, and the code for that is 476739. All right, next slide. So let's get started. First, we're going to hear more about what the project is and why Ramsey County got involved. So we'll hear first from Victoria Lawson, who's the Research Project Director at the CUNY Institute for State and Local Governance, followed by Leah Bauer, who is the Research and Evaluation Supervisor at Ramsey County Community Corrections. Once they tell us about the project, we'll hear about the findings from the research phase. And we'll start with Edward Hauk, who is a Planning and Evaluation Analyst for Ramsey County Community Corrections, and then Lily Hanrath, a Research Fellow here at the Robina Institute. I'm going to hand it over to Victoria.
Hi, so nice to meet everyone. Yeah, my name is Victoria Lawson, and I am a Research Project Director at the CUNY Institute for State and Local Governance. Next slide. So the Reducing Revocations Challenge, or RRC, is a national initiative of us, ISLG, and Arnold Ventures. And it's really focused in on using research, using data for action to transform probation supervision and also reduce the failures of that system. And so the idea here is to develop and implement strategies that will increase success on probation and improve outcomes in ways that preserve public safety, but don't over-punish sort of more minor, less harmful behaviors. We also really aim for these strategies to increase equity and to engage communities in both developing and implementing solutions. So those are just things that we've sort of raised up through this work. The work is grounded in action research in multiple sizes, in multiple sites, sorry, that kind of day. They differ in size and demographics and geography and other characteristics. And the goal is really just what Kelly was talking about, to develop solutions that come out of that research. So use that research for action, and what has been learned about what is actually driving probation violations and revocations. And all of that work is being conducted by action research teams, ARTs, which are partnerships between a local probation agency and a research organization. Next slide. So why did we launch this? I think most folks here know probation was designed as an alternative to incarceration, but instead of that, it's become a pretty major driver of mass incarceration. And we know that there's widespread use of evidence-based practices at this point, but success rates remain really low to date. I mean, almost a third of exits from probation are unsuccessful, so not great. And then at the same time, probation revocations account for a large proportion of admissions to prison, almost 1 in 4 overall, and half of those are not due to any new criminal activity. They're due to technical violations such as missed appointments, failed drug tests, that kind of thing. In all, community supervision, probation, and parole account for almost half of prison admissions across the country, which doesn't exactly scream alternative to incarceration. So clearly we need more, we need better solutions that really get at the drivers of violations or revocations. And in order to do that, we need to learn more about those drivers. And just, there really hasn't been enough information out there to date. Next slide. So enter the RRC. The first phase of the work in the RRC was to really dig into that exact question. What are the drivers of violations and revocations? We wanted to look at who it is that's being revoked, whether there are differences based on individual characteristics, case characteristics, like the original charge severity, that kind of thing. And then also, what are the actual behaviors that are associated with different outcomes? What do those look like? We selected 10 different jurisdictions, including, of course, Ramsey County and their partner, Robina, to do in-depth research to answer those questions. And we know, and many people here might also know, that administrative data, so what can be pulled out electronically, is incredibly limited. So while that was an important part of the research, we also asked all sites to dig into actual individual case files to get all of those nuances of the cases, of what individual clients are doing, what individual officer responses are, to also conduct interviews and focus groups with a wide range of stakeholders, including those outside of probation, and to really do an in-depth review of policy and practice. So using all of that information to really get a much more nuanced and detailed picture of what's happening. From there, 5 jurisdictions were selected to implement actual strategies that they developed. So all of the jurisdictions used what they learned to propose some kind of very targeted strategy based on what they learned. And then 5 of those were actually selected to receive funding. And again, one of those being Ramsey and Robina. And so the work of phase 2 started off with in-depth operational planning to really nail down all of those details of what implementation would actually look like, including doing analyses of the projected impacts, that kind of thing, looking at what might happen in terms of equity, in terms of different types of outcomes, and sort of tweak strategies based on that, and then really have hit the ground running with initial implementation, which is where we are now. Throughout all of this work, ISLG and an advisory board has provided support, has provided technical assistance, and we've also engaged in a number of peer learning events. We do sort of regular all sites calls. We'll have a summit. We had one in phase 1 and phase 2, but to really turn this into more of a learning community that can work with one another. So that's the RRC in a sort of long nutshell. I'll turn it over to Leah to talk more about why Ramsey was interested in participating.
Thanks, Victoria. And you can move to the next slide. Great, thanks. So why was Ramsey County Community Corrections interested in the Reducing Revocations Challenge? What made us pursue this work? And it really started back in 2017 with the publication of a probation revocation report by the Minnesota Sentencing Guidelines Commission. And in this report, it showed that Ramsey County had the second highest revocation rate out of the 10 judicial districts in the state of Minnesota. And not only that, if you look at this slide here, in the Twin Cities area, Ramsey County had the highest percentage of cases revoked at 20.5%. And you'll see Hennepin County here is also highlighted. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Twin Cities area, Hennepin and Ramsey are often compared to each other. Hennepin is where Minneapolis is located, and Ramsey County is where St. Paul is located. And although Hennepin County is much bigger geographically, demographically, the counties are very similar. And you'll see here that while Hennepin had significantly more felony probation cases sentenced, they had over 31,000 cases sentenced, while Ramsey had 20,000. Ramsey County actually had more revocations, and our percentage of cases revoked was twice as high. And so this, made us a little concerned. And then if you go to the next slide, in the following year, in 2018, there was another report from the Minnesota Sentencing Guideline Commissions that further broke down revocation rates by race and ethnicity. And so here we see in Ramsey County that particularly Black and American Indian individuals had the highest revocation rates to prison. And so this also stood out to us and was something that was concerning. You can move to the next slide, please. And then meanwhile, during this time, the Robina and Ramsey County were starting to form a partnership. Between 2013 and 2016, the Robina Institute conducted research of probation revocation practices across the country. They profiled 6 jurisdictions. Ramsey County happened to be one of those jurisdictions. And through that research, Robina and Ramsey County Community Corrections began to work together and formed a pretty strong relationship. And then in 2017, the Ramsey County Community Correction Department established a strategic goal of more community, less confinement. And really the purpose of this goal is to increase the use of and success of community supervision strategies and reduce the reliance on incarceration while maintaining public safety. And because of what we saw in the 17 and 18 reports about our high revocation rates, and this did not align with our strategic goal, we approached Robina to discuss ways we could partner to try to explore what was going on in our county and why we were revoking so many individuals back to prison. And then in 2018, Ramsey County introduced a strategic goal of advancing race and health equity in all decision-making. And because of the racial disparities that we saw in our revocation rates, this further prompted our department to really address this issue. And so again, we worked with Robina and we began identifying research questions. We began to collect data and do some initial analysis. And that ultimately led us to apply for the Reducing Revocations Challenge. And that is why we are here today. So I will pass it on to Lily and Ed.
Excellent. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Ed first and then Lily second. And we are now going to switch to giving you some information about what we actually found. So Ed, why don't you get started for us?
Thanks, Kelly. Hi, everyone. Ed Hauk with Ramsey County. And I want to give a brief introduction, knowing that we have people on this call that are from probably a lot of different communities and maybe have different levels of familiarity with Ramsey County and or the state of Minnesota. So just a little bit of context and background about community supervision in the county and the state. And then I will introduce some of the action research portion of the work. So we'll go to the next slide. So Ramsey County is the geographically smallest and most densely populated county in the state of Minnesota. And we're one of 7 counties that are in that Twin Cities metropolitan area. About half of our residents live in the city of St. Paul. The other half are dispersed across the surrounding suburban communities. So we're an urban suburban county. We're also the most racially diverse county in the state of Minnesota, with about 40% of our residents identifying as Black, Indigenous, or other persons of color. Let's go to the next slide. So when we think about this, the RRC initiative, we think about the work, just to think a little bit about how community corrections looks and is delivered in the state of Minnesota. The Minnesota is a unique 3-tiered community corrections delivery system. So if you look at that map on the left, the Ramsey is one of the 35 counties in, I think that's olive or maybe gold color. It is a county that administers and operates all of its community corrections services. Counties in blue are the services for community corrections are provided by the Minnesota Department of Corrections, which is our statewide agency. And these orange counties have kind of a hybrid model. The point kind of to make here is that Minnesota, again, has a county-based decentralized system, and then across delivery systems and across the counties, there's a great deal of local control, autonomy, and discretion for how community supervision is structured and gets delivered. In other words, within jurisdictions, there can be different policies, practices, procedures, priorities, even different missions and visions around community supervision. And one example that we'll kind of tease out as we go forward, one concrete example, I think, is how within various counties and departments, how we respond when somebody on probation violates the terms and conditions of their supervision. It's an example of where there is some discretion and local control. We look at that table down at the bottom. It's important to, we hear about within the United States being, the mass incarceration context for our criminal justice system. In Minnesota, I think the term mass supervision applies. We're a mass supervision state. We have, nearly 7 times the number of people on community supervision compared to in prison or in jail. We rank 6th nationally in the rate of adult residents who are on community supervision. We're about 45th for incarceration, state prison, or jail. I note this to say that, to emphasize the importance of, while you might think of like these as mutually exclusive, they're actually not, because community supervision, while we often see it as an alternative to incarceration, can actually act as a gateway to incarceration. Victoria noted this earlier. I think on her slide, 25% of admissions to prison nationally are the result of probation violations. Leah also kind of highlighted our, within the state and within Ramsey County, our revocation rate. So just recognizing that that community supervision can be a pathway to incarceration, and that our action research is looking to understand more about that pathway. And also, we talk about community supervision in Minnesota and prison, that a prison isn't necessarily the only revocation pathway, that prison is reserved for felony level individuals, but there are individuals on probation on non-felonies. And so really trying to understand that group's pathway and just the frequency and prevalence of revocations for that group as well. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, the slide is the figure here is a bit hard to read, I realize, but we just included it to really emphasize the following point. When we talk about the probation pathway and the probation system in Ramsey County, there are a series of complex and decision points and processes and that the probation pathway it isn't just siloed in probation, right? It's there includes and is influenced by other partners and stakeholders in our justice system, the courts, prosecution and defense attorneys, and community providers, and not to mention the actual person on probation that will need to traverse and navigate this pathway. And I think just to also note that it just reinforces the importance and the need for us within the action research to kind of incorporate and include not just probation, but to get other perspectives from our partners in that process. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the action research and kind of our overarching questions and sort of a design for it. Two broad questions. First, what is the pathway to revocation for people on probation in Ramsey County? Second, we wanted to learn what are the drivers of probation violations and revocations in Ramsey County. And to explore these questions, we had three data sources we relied on. First, a legal and policy review. Second, interviews, which we conducted 44 interviews with individuals within or in proximity to our criminal justice system. About half were with probation, the other half across the bench, prosecution, defense, and other community providers. And third, we relied on an administrative data set for a cohort of people who were placed on probation with Ramsey County. And we collected a variety of information there: demographics, supervision type, risk level, case level, characteristics related to the offense and the sentencing, as well as some more detailed information for those individuals who did have a probation violation during the study period. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here. Next slide. Okay, just going to highlight a couple of data considerations and challenges with this administrative data set. From my perspective and having to do a lot of the work pulling the data set, the good news is much of this information was able to be pulled electronically, right? We're working with a lot of structured data out of our central case management system. However, at the time we were utilizing a different or separate, I should say, system for completing and filing probation violations. And so while it was an electronic system, there was a lot of unstructured sort of free text narrative data that was, again, challenging for a variety of reasons, but one of those being just the fact that it was unstructured. In addition, some of the elements we were interested in, such as what actually happened as a result of the violation, sat in another sort of separate place, and it wasn't really tethered or anchored to that violation data. This is just a way to say that after kind of looking at this, we could tell from that system whether a violation was filed and when it was filed, but really to understand some of the details around the contents of the violation and the outcome was much more difficult. So we went into a more detailed process where we had 3 staff members dedicated to do manual coding. We ended up coding over 1,900 violation instances to identify some of the characteristics and details we were interested in. Again, reasons for the violation, like why are probation violations being filed? What are the allegations? The recommendations that are being made at the time of filing by the probation officer to the court, as well as the outcome of the violation ultimately determined by the court, which that outcome could include a revocation of probation. So just to give a little bit of detail there to what for obtaining this information about violations and revocations, kind of what we had to go through. The other challenge I'll just highlight is that it was not uncommon to have multiple allegations in a probation violation. About 70% of the violations we reviewed had multiple violations alleged. So the research or the study team attempted to identify kind of the driver of the violation, trying to figure out what the primary reason or the tipping point for filing that violation was. And we did that through, again, a review of the allegations, as well as some of the rich probation adjustment narrative that the probation officers provide to the court. I'm going to turn it over here in just a second, but I will say I could spend a little bit more time talking about some of the preparation and thought that we put into this portion of the project. But I will just say that this wasn't a situation where we said, okay, we need to code violations, let's go, that there was a lot of work throughout from pre-work to after the coding process happened to ensure that we had reliable, actionable information. And so we'll conclude there, and I'm going to turn it over to Lily to talk more about what we found.
All right. As Ed said, we could both talk about this for days probably, and I do recommend that you look at the full report or executive summary on Robina's website if you're interested. But I'm just going to highlight the kind of broad findings about the violation revocation pathway, as well as some findings about race. And I'm not going to go into all the details in methods or other findings. I'm also going to really focus on some of the quotes from the interviews, as I think the interviews really kind of change how we think about the quantitative findings, as well as add their own findings. So to start with, what's a great thing we have here is that we have information on felony, gross misdemeanor, and misdemeanor cases. So as Leah mentioned, we have some, information from prior reports on felonies, but we didn't actually have much information on what was occurring on lower levels. So we looked at all people who started probation in 2016, and we followed them for 2 years to look at if they were successful or if they were violated or revoked in that time period. They could possibly be revoked after that time period, but the majority, if they're going to have issues, are going to have issues in those first 2 years. I also want to note here on the racial breakdown that we see that Black individuals in particular are overrepresented on probation. There's 3 times as many as you would expect based on the population. And I also want to note that Native Americans are also overrepresented. So even though it's just 2% versus 1%, that is double the rate, and it's still a significant portion of people. So looking at just general outcomes, to start with, the majority of people never got a violation. I think a lot of times there's a focus on the negatives in our system and the issues, but I want to note that most people had a positive, outcome. Victoria mentioned that it's 50% unsuccessful in the general statistics. And here we're seeing that Ramsey actually has a slightly higher success rate than you'd expect. And of those who did get violated, the majority of those only got 1 violation. Now, that's partly because some of them got revoked, so they couldn't get a further revocation violation. But even amongst those who didn't get revoked, we see a lot of people have that violation, have some kind of consequence, and then bounce back from that. So there's a lot of success, and I think it's important when thinking about policy to think about what we can do for those successful people as well as the unsuccessful people. So one possibility is to use early discharge. So people who are not violating, who have completed all their programs that they're supposed to do, have paid off all their fines and fees, we might think they don't need to be on probation any longer. Interviews indicated that officers were very open to using early discharge, but didn't put a lot of thought into it specifically. So this mentions here, if the client reaches out, then I will consider early discharge. If they're eligible, I'll look at it once I get around to it. So it's not something that's kind of in their plan. It's more something that if it comes up, they'll consider. So it would be a good idea to make sure that's more in the front of people's minds, because there's a lot of people that probably are eligible but aren't being put on early discharge just because it's not coming up. So here, I'm going to show you specifically those who get violated. So this graph's a little cut off. Normally there'd be another chunk that shows the people who didn't get a violation. But of those who got violated, most of those were founded in the court. So they weren't completely, out of left field. But about 2/3 of those didn't get revoked. They continued probation. But even the people who continued were likely to have some sort of local incarceration at the jail or RCCF. So either way, we're seeing a lot of people going back to either jail or prison if they get a violation for at least some portion of time. You'll note here too that we considered early discharges of probation here as revocations, which seems unusual, but it's because it indicates a lack of success. So our interviews and background policy work shows that a lot of times people might get discharged because either they were in jail prior to the hearing and they basically finished off their term, or because they have another case. So they were essentially discharged to be put on a different probation or on a different prison term. So here's a quote from a probation officer that says, in most cases, when you feel like there's still room and time to work with them, then you just feel they need an immediate consequence for the behavior you're showing right then, and then you can continue working with them after that. I always tell my clients, once the violation's done, you get a fresh start. So this shows that, a violation isn't necessarily the end of the world. However, other quotes do indicate that even for those people who weren't revoked, they're going to jail for 30 or 60 days, which is a pretty significant amount of time and could really stop people from being able to be employed or kind of complete programs on time for their probation. So this defense attorney indicated that you're seeing up to 120 days served for people who aren't revoked. A lot of people might argue once you're getting to 120 days, it might as well be a revocation. And this is something that is pretty consistent across these cases. So here are the violations broken down by level of offense. And you see, as you might expect, that we're seeing more violations for felonies than for gross misdemeanors and misdemeanors. They're much quicker to violate for felonies. And also we see felonies have more new crimes, which is something I'll discuss later. So that might be what you expect. But what's odd is we actually see higher revocation rates for the misdemeanors and gross misdemeanors than the felonies. So part of this might be because they're less likely to get a violation in the first place, and they're only violated when it's a revocation type issue. But another thing is that people have indicated that the misdemeanor cases are often violated near the end of their terms when they have no time to finish things. And they don't have any time to complete programs they might not have completed. And also, there's some indication that it's not seen as serious to revoke a misdemeanor. So the idea of going back to jail is not seen as much of a big issue for people as going back to prison would be. Looking at the recommendations, we see that the judges recommend continuing rather than revoking at a higher rate than the probation officer recommends. So oftentimes a probation officer might recommend a revocation and it not occur. And from the quantitative data alone, it looks like there's some disagreement here in the system. But interviews actually indicate that probation officers often haven't talked to their clients due to absconding or a failure to maintain contact. And they might actually change their mind on the spot in the court hearing. So probation officers that actually show up to these hearings might say, oh, now that I know what your issue is, I think I could work with you and I don't need to recommend a revocation. So that's not something that's indicated in the quantitative data, but really informs what's going on in the process. So now looking at those same outcomes, but kind of by race, we see a really complicated pattern depending on the offense level. So starting first with violations, I'm using a line here to compare the white cases to the other cases, as that's often the default. And you see that certain minority groups are more likely to get violations. So in this, for felonies, we see Black and Native American and multiracial groups are more likely to get these violations. And we also see that to even a higher degree for the misdemeanor and gross misdemeanors. So even when we have small numbers like the Native American group, this is still a significant result, judging by our statistics. But then looking at revocations, you actually see kind of a split between the two groups. So with felonies, once again, comparing to white, you can see more of that orange is under the red bar for most of these minority groups, which indicates that they are getting revoked more often. And this is controlling for other factors. We still see this. Controlling for the violations, we kind of see similar rates. But overall, we see an issue there. And then for the misdemeanors, we're actually seeing less revocations for the minority groups, particularly Black, Native American, multiracial groups. And that might indicate a correction process is occurring. So if these groups are being violated unnecessarily when white people of a similar type are not getting violated, it might be that once they get to court, they're not revoked, but rather continued because they probably shouldn't have had that violation. And this could be for a multitude of reasons, whether it be a cultural issue or, racial, issues between the officer and the person. It's the difference in types of violations. There's a lot of reasons that this could be occurring. My point is, a lower revocation rate in this case might not actually show a positive thing. It could be a negative for minorities, whether or not they get more or less revocations. So here's a really powerful quote we heard from a community service provider who themselves has been in the system. They mentioned that the system is just another level of devaluating me as a Black man, which feeds my rage. So it's really hard for people to work with their probation officers or with the court when they feel like they're already at a disadvantage. And, the statistics indicate that they're correct on that. So if they feel like they're already not going to be treated fairly, or they're not going to have the same understanding or the resources that other people get, it's going to create a negative relationship that's going to result in more problems. And this is something that we saw coming up as well with probation officers who said that sometimes there were cultural issues with certain populations where they didn't feel like they had the knowledge necessary, or that the officers weren't available who had the same community experience. And so then turning from that to what the violations are. So Ed mentioned that we specifically coded what the driving violation is. And I want to mention that most violations did have multiple things listed. So just looking at the driving things, it really came down to a few specific types of violations that were most common. And this is the case across felonies and misdemeanors. So as expected, we see a lot of new crimes, which they're usually required to violate for at some point. But we also see a lot of people being violated simply for not showing up at all to their meetings. And a lot of those actually didn't even show up to the first meeting. And then finally, we see violations related to drug use. So whether they don't complete programming or treatment, or they have some kind of UA failure or substance use that is violated for. So those are pretty common things. We also have other violation types, but those were the most common. And I want to mention here that the failure to maintain contact issue is exceedingly common, and more than I think we expected. So this person mentions that in terms of new crime violations, they're really quick to pull the trigger on that because of a public safety issue, and also because a lot of times their department requires that they violate, particularly for certain groups like domestic abuse cases, where they might be concerned about recidivism there. So those are absolutely must violate cases. But then turning to the other groups, those technical violations, which are pretty common, we see a lot of cases where the person might have some issues or needs that aren't being met, rather than just violating out of, a sense of obstinance. So for example, they might have some kind of chemical dependency issue, a housing issue, issues with employment, issues with mental health. I really like this quote where the defense attorney says, most of my clients live in a world that's very much about today. So they're concerned, where am I sleeping tonight? What am I going to eat? How are my children going to be? And so it's hard for them to keep track of all these conditions they have to follow and be able to go to the probation officer when they have other things that are kind of more pressing in terms of just being able to live. And then finally, the failure to maintain contact group is a special one because it's really difficult to know exactly why they're not maintaining contact because they're not talking to us. So this prosecutor says, when they see absconding, they don't think about absconding. They assume there's some other reason like homelessness or mental health, drug use. And this is a real hard thing to get at. I've talked to probation officers in some other departments, and there's this kind of belief that failure to maintain contact is running. So people that are kind of violating out of a lack of respect. But this research and future research we're doing indicates that there's often a lot of things going on in people's life, and this kind of just falls by the wayside. So that's a very quick overview of the data. Like I mentioned, there's a lot more of the reports on our website, as well as if you want to contact any of us, we'd all be interested in helping you out. But I don't know if there's any quick questions I can answer about the data before we go into the phase 2. I believe, Kelly, you're going to let me know.
I am. All right. Well, thank you very much, Lily, for giving us that really quick overview. I'm not seeing any questions right at the moment, so I think we will go ahead and move forward to the next section of our discussion today, which is really talking about implementation. In the meantime, if people do have questions about what you've seen so far, go ahead and put them in the Q&A section, and we will address those at the end. So for the next section, I'm going to bring back a panel of people who have served with us throughout the project, both on our project management team and on our advisory committee for the project. And we haven't talked much about the advisory committee yet, but I just want to highlight that throughout the Reducing Revocations Challenge portion and now in the implementation phase, we've had an advisory committee that's comprised of people from across the criminal justice system, as well as treatment providers and members of the community. And they have really shaped the responses that we've had that we want to have to the results of the research. Joining us today, we will have Judge Ronaldo Alagada, who is a judge in the 2nd Judicial District of Minnesota, and that is Ramsey County. So the 2nd Judicial District overlays exactly with county lines. Leah Bauer will be returning to join us as a panelist. Corey Hazelton, who is Assistant Division Director of Adult Field Services from Ramsey County. Lyle H. Moccasin, who is an Outreach and Reentry Coordinator with the Dakota Institute at the American Indian OIC. And Chris Emba, who is a Racial and Health Equity Planner for Ramsey County Community Corrections. Next slide, please. Next slide. Before I turn to them, I just want to give you the quickest introduction to what this advisory committee came up with. So we along the way, we at Robina were presenting the results of the research as it was rolling in. And towards the end of that process, as Victoria explained, it was up to the advisory committee to say, okay, so what do we do with this? What's next? What's our plan? One of the members of our advisory committee came up with this 3-lane framework for us to work within. And then we had a couple of meetings to really build it out with the advisory committee. And we call it the 3-lane strategy for increasing success of people on probation. We've really broken the work into 3 parts, and we have work groups working on each one of these 3 parts. In lane 1, the goal is to equitably reduce the correctional footprint. So what we're trying to do there is identify whether there are cases in which people do not need to be on supervision. So some of the strategies that we're looking at are there cases where people could be unsupervised? Do we have some cases with long probation sentences that could potentially be reduced? What about early discharge? Ramsey has early discharge policies, but didn't have a structured way of implementing that. So could we structure that so it's used more frequently? And could we develop early discharge for those situations where there weren't existing policies? In lane 2, we're looking to equitably amplify social health and welfare services and reduce technical violations. So this is really getting at the group that was lacking basic needs, right? We want to make sure that we bring the county's resources to bear to help that group. Maybe they don't need as much supervision, but they need more support. So the goal there, some of the strategies are to increase collaboration with social services, incorporate incentives into the responses to violations, and reduce the number of probation conditions. I think somebody had mentioned that in the chat along the way. We are looking at that issue as well. And we want to reduce the number of conditions and individualize them to the person's situation. Lane 3 are the folks who maybe need a more correctional response. So here we want to promote behavioral change and prevent reoffending by providing appropriate correctional interventions. We sort of see this as two potential groups of people. One set might be people for whom our sentencing guidelines in Minnesota recommend prison, but they've been given a sentence of probation instead. The other group are people who may be high risk for reoffending. A couple of ways that we're looking at going at that. We mentioned that we have a lot of failure to maintain contact violations. So we actually have a study going on in this section where we're interviewing people on probation to figure out what's actually going on with those types of violations. We want to rethink the use of incarceration. So we're looking at that issue as well. Does it always need to be a default? Does it need to be as many days as we've used, or could we use shorter stints to sort of get the same results? And then the big thing that I think we want to talk about at some point today is we're looking at creating navigator positions, somebody who can provide more peer-to-peer support for people on probation and help get them through those more difficult periods of their probation sentence. So with that, we're going to go ahead and stop sharing the slide. I'm going to bring the panel up and we are going to get into a discussion. So the first question I really have is, I'll be honest, when we developed this 3-lane framework for, the next steps that we would take, I really thought that Ramsey would say, okay, well, there's a lot of interesting strategies in there. Let's pick a couple of those and just implement those, because that would have been easier. But that's not what happened. Instead, Ramsey sort of went full in and decided to go after the entire framework. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about, why was that the approach that you took? Leah or Corey, since you're our Ramsey representative, maybe you could start with that one.
I can start it off. I think part of it is we just realized how many connections there were. Once we started meeting, once we started talking about, once we started getting a little bit more detailed about where the issues were, first of all, we realized that we weren't collaborating as much as we should, not only with the community or even with other departments in Ramsey County, but we weren't even collaborating with each other very well. And I mean, county attorney, St. Paul police, judges. We started to look at duplication of services. We started to look at the whole thing in general. And then we started to look at those connections and realized all of those kind of were relevant. And part of it too is that it was difficult to prioritize because they were all really important. I think you're right, Kelly. I think some of it would have been, okay, let's start small and let's work it up. We started big and are working back, but we're starting to see the fruits of our labor because we are starting to see some really good results with almost all of these. Is it too much to take on at one time? Probably. But I think we're pretty happy with the results so far.
Who else wants? Anyone else want to take that?
I can add on to what Corey was saying. I think also thinking about how we could make these changes effectable and sustainable long-term really meant that we had to take a more reform and transformational kind of view of this work and not just choose something here and there. So I think that was something that the advisory committee talked about and all of those working on the project talked about. I also think this type of approach aligns well with county priorities. Right now, some key county priorities are around advancing racial and health equity and shared community power, as well as putting well-being and community at the center of justice system transformation. Those are both very big ideas. And I think the work we're doing aligns with that path.
Any other thoughts before we? All right. Well, one of the things that I think is really unique about the approach for this particular project is the fact that there was an advisory committee, a cross-system advisory committee working on the project the whole way through. And now the work groups that are working on these strategies within each of the lanes is also each work group is set up to have multiple system partners, multiple members of the community working on these issues. So that's a sort of unique approach. And I was just wondering if we could talk about, why was it important to take that approach, and what are some of the pros and cons of working that way? Judge Algado?
I can take this question. Just for some context, both at the advisory committee level and in our individual lane work groups, I'm on the advisory committee and one of the lane work groups. It's an incredibly broad set of partners that are a part of that communication. So you've got people from Ramsey County Community Corrections, but you also have judges, public defenders, prosecutors, people from the community, and that includes people that have been on probation before. If we want to solve problems and make sure that probation is successful for more people and that people's lives are bettered by probation, then I think you have to talk to each other. And one of the things that happens in these work groups, and I'll tell you, we've been working hard and we've spent lots of hours talking to each other, is that you start to understand what, in a cross-system way, everybody's role is in the process of placing people on probation success, and on probation failure. And when you have those conversations, it just allows you to think in a system way about how to achieve the goals of the Reducing Revocations Challenge. So part one is, and one of the benefits is just, we don't always have informal ways to have these communications. And when you are thinking about it, not in the context of an individual case or an individual client, you're really talking about it from a systems perspective. The cross-group communication is really helpful. And I think it will just help us all do our jobs better. I think also that what Leah said about lasting results is really important. You can't change a system like this, even in incremental ways, without buy-in from each of the people that are involved in each of the systems that are involved. As a judge, our role is setting conditions, and then if a case comes to us as a probation violation, and having that judicial process and learning more about how probation conditions get set from the beginning has been important for everybody. And I think that if you understand why things will change with any reform that happens, then there's buy-in from each of the actors in the system, and we hope buy-in from the community as well, because that's an important part of it. So having those communications are helpful. When I think about your question about cons, I don't know that this is a con. It is a reality of the process. We're not all going to agree all the time. Each of us wear our hats, and we talk about non-negotiables, and we talk about things that matter to each of us. For prosecutors and judges, we care about protecting community safety in addition to having people succeed on probation. Those are things we talk about. But I think we all can take our hats off for a moment and think about what problem solving means from someone else's perspective. So I think, we have throughout this process had very difficult conversations about what we think is doable and what's not doable. But overall, the breadth of who is part of this process has been really beneficial, and really good policy work, I think, to have so many voices at the table. And I'll just note that includes community members. And as I indicated before, it includes people who have been on probation. They can speak with authenticity and legitimacy about, what it means to them, because that's part of the conversation.
Yeah, I'm gonna take moderator's privilege and put a little color to your answer. Yesterday, I participated in lane 2. I'm working on the issue of what conditions should be ordered as part of probation. And we've just been talking condition by condition, taking the most frequently ordered conditions and talking through, well, what does that condition mean? What is it for? What is it? Are we being truthful in the way that we're talking about it or enforcing it? So one example that we talked about yesterday was the, condition to have no alcohol or no controlled substance use. And that was a really long conversation, because on the one hand, I was arguing, well, it's actually impossible if you're addicted to immediately stop using. Is that what we're telling them they have to do? On the other hand, it was like, well, maybe sometimes that is what we're looking for. Maybe public safety requires that. So we were really kind of going back and forth, and we were lucky enough to have someone in our group who'd actually been subject to that condition to talk about what it was like to try to comply with that condition. So really robust discussions in these work groups, and multiple perspectives helping us sort of understand, you know, what we're listening to or what we're trying to do to get to the next step. Any other comments on that one? Okay, well, we talked about community. Judge Aligata, you mentioned that community is part of this in each of our groups. And that's also another unique aspect of this particular project. So what I'd like to talk about is what does it look like to engage community members? What strategies have you used, and what have sort of been some of the benefits of that? So I'd like Chris to take that one on.
Thanks, Kelly. So it's, just from personal experience, it's been a challenge building trust. In the past, due to the lack of trust by community members, especially those with lived experience about how unfairly they have been treated by the system, they have lost hope. They feel they haven't had meaningful engagement with government. Even when they have attempted to engage, they haven't been clear on what the government has done with their feedback. There has also been disagreement from different parties about how to build trust. Not everyone agrees with how it is unfolding. My role has been to help build that rapport with community. So we recognize that engaging community when done in a meaningful way is one of the most impactful ways we as Ramsey County employees can build relationship and share power and advance race equity. Meaningful community engagement actively seeks partnerships and inclusion of community members affected by our decisions, programs, and actions. Meaningful community engagement asks for feedback, input, and guidance from those with lived experience to inform our decisions and improve our services. We've been carefully using these approaches in developing rapport with community members. With that said, we started with our recruitment process by using channels such as our department Racial Equity and Community Engagement Action Team. We utilize, social media like Facebook. We connected with community providers. We use word of mouth. We also met with some members of the Minnesota Prison Doula Project, all of whom indicated they have lived experience. They were all very interested in participating in Lane 2 and 3 work groups. That meeting alone boosted our recruitment number to 15 community members as of now. Lots of thought have been put into how to support community members who are participating in this process so they continue to stay involved. For example, we've been having separate meetings with community members outside of our regular work group meetings to provide space for rapport building, ensuring community members feel safe, supported, and can bring their full selves into the work groups. We had the last meeting was last Friday that we met with community members. And I must say that, this was one of the most amazing, knowing that, we are actually seeing the results by the way the participation of those members, the fact that they were willing to be vulnerable in that space, the fact that they were willing to share such deep-seated challenges and concerns that they have and are experiencing. And everyone just shared such stories about their challenges. They also provided what they think would help in this process to make it better. And some even talked about, if not for them, others who are going through similar challenges, so they don't have to go through the same challenges. But just knowing that we've come this far to build that type of a relationship, to build that rapport with community, to get them to engage, to bring their full selves into the process, and having these conversations, I think that it shows how much we have invested in this process and what we are doing to make sure that they are recognized and they are fully participating and being a part of the process for change.
Yeah, and tell me a little bit too, Chris, if you wouldn't mind keeping on this topic for a minute. You know, community has been really important to the development of the navigator concept. Could you just touch on that briefly as well?
Yeah, we actually, when we started talking about this navigator position, we realized at that time that we didn't have enough community representation. And so we decided to pause that process until we had recruited enough members. And that's where we are right now in terms of having, between that period of now, we've recruited 15 additional members, community members. So we have decided, okay, let's work on a consensus workshop for reducing revocations challenge navigator position to determine what would go into the duties and responsibilities of that position, with the rational aim being to affirm participants' experiences and obtain their engagement and commitment, and the experiential aim being to energize participants to allow them to submit creative and innovative ideas in a collaborative environment towards a shared purpose. And we've already started having conversations with community members who are really, really excited. They were able to share some of the information that they shared, during a meeting on Friday. Right away, I could see that going into that navigator position in terms of what they would like to see in that position. What kind of skills, abilities, lived experience. They talked about that. They talked about someone who has, who has the ability to get resources right away when clients need those resources. They talked about someone who understands that you have people with varying experiences, varying challenges. They talked about people that, come into that space or who meet with their probation officers and struggle because they have, third, fourth education, grade education, and some, actually struggle with brain injuries. And there is that disconnect with understanding what, the communication with their probation officers and what they would need to see someone with that position to be equipped with the type of resources and skills to help those clients. So there's a lot of conversation that took place that Friday that I just felt like, wow, this is really going to help during our consensus workshop when we meet with community members to try to develop that position and what the duties and responsibilities would go, what they see as the duties and responsibilities that will help them.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the more community-led pieces of the work that we're doing right now. It's really exciting to see that happen. Lyle, if you don't mind, I'm going to turn to you. During phase one, we had intended to interview people on probation as well, but phase one actually occurred during COVID. So we had some issues we had some barriers, additional barriers, and we really didn't get to interview as many people as we wanted to during that phase. But I remember, Lyle, that I reached out to you specifically during that period because we knew that people who were Native American were seeing worse results on average than people who were Black and Native American were seeing worse results. But I was really hoping that you could connect us with people in the Native American community during that phase. And I remember you also talking about the lack of trust. So tell me, what has your involvement in this project, has it helped in that regard with the Native American community or with you yourself interacting with folks from that community?
Well, I've got a background in law enforcement, so I have a connection to the system itself and multiple different venues, both with the Ramsey County and the state and the federal. So I have a pretty good understanding of how the system worked. It's getting the broader community, the Native American Indigenous community, having an understanding of what that system is and how it works. When you talked about, what are some of the cons one of the things we had was connecting with the community that doesn't have the resources to connect with the system. We do a lot of resourcing and referral systems within our organization, and that's where we make our bread and butter from, is being able to take our clients and connect them with the correct resources and act as, you know, every single person that works here at our school or institute are navigators. They all got backgrounds and experiences in doing this. And getting that information to the community itself is the most difficult part. There's where the issues and the barriers are, is getting information to the community, particularly during the pandemic. That's where the problem lies, was that we don't have the social networks or the social media systems in place that the other communities have. You know, we don't have radio stations, we don't have television stations, we don't have all these things that you can use as a vehicle to connect individuals. Ours is word of mouth, different types of ceremonial and spiritual activities. These are in-person things, and being a culture of a verbal culture, that itself created some issues. So this is an ongoing scenario. One of the things I've been talking about recently is being anxious to get back into the prisons. I don't know many people are happy about going to prison, but that's one of the things that I'm, you know, happy about getting back into, and getting back into communicating with those. And I still do this a lot of stuff with the different organizations within our geographical areas. I also work with a lot of the culture, the organizations outstate. And one of the things about the indigenous communities, we travel around the state a lot. You know, we got 11 reservations in this state, and we've got a lot of transit individuals going back and forth to the metro area, back to the reservations. So there again is another area we need to start looking at. But you know, we've got other organizations that are definitely helping out up in Bemidji. We got the American Indian Community Development area there that the folks are starting to work with, and also the system itself. You know, I have to give some credit to Ramsey County for initiating this whole process. I've been working with Ramsey County Corrections for a couple of decades, and finding that their initiative to get this type of action going is one of the ways we will help develop and reduce the mistrust that goes on between our communities. You can go on and on and on about the issues around trust. Chris has touched on it. The thing here is, one of the big issues we have is that whenever we get in contact with the system, that system is not native. There is not a native person in the court systems. There are not native persons in the POs, and law enforcement is lacking a substantial diversity. So whenever we get involved with any of these entities, it's always someone else's issue, someone else's problem, and we're the ones that are trying to contend with trying to overcome these issues and barriers. And fortunately for us, we have a system now that has opened up a great deal over the last couple of years. The political structures have changed drastically. Having a Native American as lieutenant governor certainly helped a great deal. And then having the institutions like the Robina actually having a say in how things are done, and having that transparency is a major contributor to how we reduce and increase the trust areas within those areas. Is that what we're looking for?
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, that was great. I want to keep going with the topic though of racial and ethnic disparity. The findings from phase 1 show that people who are Black and Native American have more violations and revocations. And so I want to talk to the group about, you know, what is being done in this phase to, you know, keep those disparities, keep that thought at the forefront, and try to ensure racial and ethnic equity as we develop and implement changes to practices and policies. Leah, did you want to talk on the technical side? Oh, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, the thing here is that, you know, if we have a say in it, you know, individuals like myself are getting involved on a limited basis. I'd like to see more of a diversity from the other end. The hiring of the navigator is going to be a major indicator of that diversity. And seeing that if we can get our community leaders involved at a level where they've got some line of communication. This has always been the issue with the system, is that the communication is one way. It's not two-way or three-way, which we should have. So the system now is opening up and getting considerably more transparent, and that communication is increasing. And that's what we would like to see, is that increase in communication, and not only listening and talking, but actually the actions. We can talk and converse on all of these different entities that we've got going on here, but I want to see where we're going to be at the end of a year from now. What were the results? How do are these results making any changes? And if they are making changes, how do we continue it and expand it? Thank you.
Yeah, excellent. Other thoughts on this question? Leah, we're sort of doing a technical view. I'll come back to you just a minute, Chris, but Leah, there's a technical way that we're also looking at this. Maybe you could just quickly touch on that, and then I'd like Chris to go ahead and respond.
Yeah, sure. And this is from the measurement side of things, that during this phase 2, we are trying to develop metrics around each of the work groups to really measure what we're doing and disaggregate them by race. So for example, we talked about looking at conditions and potentially reducing conditions for folks. And so we'll be tracking that and looking at that, disaggregating it by race to make sure that we aren't inadvertently making our disparities worse. We'll also be looking at data around early discharge and use of confinement. I think we're going to continually, this is a work in progress, and we'll continually kind of tweak our metrics as we move forward. But I think to bring back that information on an ongoing basis, so we have some kind of benchmark or an idea of, are we at least headed in the right direction? Or if we aren't, we need to stop and reevaluate and take another approach.
So definitely data, definitely communication, as Lyle mentioned. Chris, what were you going to say?
No, I was going to add that, we have been, we've shifted, to long-term, thinking around these issues. The first step was, acknowledging that there is an issue and there is recognition across stakeholders. Race equity is an important part of our continuing discussion. The community's involvement in deciding what reforms should look like and how they should be implemented should help minimize unintended consequences. And I talked about, working on this consensus workshop with community as, part of that. And I was also going to add that, we are looking at, some dates in January to actually, work on the consensus workshop so we can actually have a job description for the navigator position. And so community member representation in this process is very, very important, because they will help guide us. They will help inform us about the challenges that they see, from personal experience to community, and what they would need to see in that position to help people like themselves, like they talked about last Friday, and others that are struggling.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on that one? Okay. Well, we're getting short on time. I want to leave some time for questions. So I actually just want to give everyone one last word, and I'd like to go around and have everybody just sort of talk about, from your perspective, what do you think has been sort of the greatest challenge and the greatest accomplishment of this work? And on my screen, Judge Alagata is top middle, so I'm going to start with him.
Sounds good. I think the hardest challenge is that this is a very complex policy discussion that involves affecting real people's lives. And if you take it seriously, it's really hard work. It's hard work to sift through all the things that are our responsibilities as an advisory group. And it's hard work to look at in each individual lane what's important. We have had, as I mentioned, hours and hours of meetings. And sometimes it's difficult to keep your eye on the ball in the sense of we're trying to solve a bigger problem, but still keep talking to each other. That's a challenge that is also, I think, the most important part of the work. And I also think that, I think there are just side benefits to being able to talk to each other. We all learn more about our roles in the system. We all learn more about improving the lives of people in probation. And hopefully that solves the bigger problem of making sure that people are succeeding and the community is safe all at the same time, which is one of the goals. So there are lots of benefits in this process, but it is really hard work.
Thanks. Leah.
Well, I think I'll kind of build on what you just said, Judge. I think for me, the greatest challenge and the greatest accomplishment has kind of been the same thing in that it's all the people involved in this work, how we have all the different stakeholders from the different justice partners, but also community and people with lived experience. I think that is a huge accomplishment, the amount of time and effort to get all these folks at the table and to create as safe a space as we can for people to have authentic conversations and truly kind of envision a new system. I also think it's been a great challenge. It's a lot of time. It's hard work, as the judge said. It's also, we have to be comfortable being uncomfortable, right? And we sit in spaces that can be really, really challenging at times.
Thanks. And I want to just piggyback on both of you and say, it's also an accomplishment that everybody is still at the table. We have had some tense conversations along the way, but people come back to the table every time, even after those conversations. Corey, what's your greatest accomplishment, greatest challenge?
Well, and they hit it a little bit with the community, and I think there's layers to that because not only, you don't want to get it too big, but we brought in as much as we can people with lived experience and people that represent certain areas, but they're also leaders in the group. I mean, they're the co-facilitators. We listen, they have as much say as everyone else, and it's legitimate. It's not, I think we had a tendency sometimes to decide a change and then let everyone know after the fact that it had been done. They're involved in the discussion early, and we're also bringing in people that disagree with us. You mentioned that as well, is you can't cherry pick everyone who's going to say, hey, let's bring in 15 people who are all going to agree with everything we're going to say so we can get this moving quickly. Part of the reason this is taking long is because people are bringing up some legitimate points that we had forgotten about and things that, not that we'd forgotten about, but maybe we didn't give it as much credence as we should have. And it's just far as the corrections in general, I mean, I think we really pushed to start this conversation, but I think some of the original thought is that we can't do anything about the people that come our way. But we can. I mean, especially when we're talking with judges and prosecutors and public defenders and a lot of the court system, they are listening to us about who we think should and shouldn't benefit from probation services. And I think we've really expanded past that point where we are involved in that discussion as opposed to just waiting to see who comes our way and then maybe bringing it up after the fact. So that's the part that I've really been happy with as far as accomplishments and just kind of the overall collaboration of it. And it's authentic, it's real. It's not something that we can tell people later on, hey, look at all the people that were involved. It's genuine.
Thanks. Lyle, what are your thoughts?
Well, one of the challenges has been getting the community involvement in developing that trust level, and one of the things that I've I wouldn't have thought about doing because I'm not a social media type, but this webinar is very open, very transparent. So I'm pretty sure I'm going to be getting a lot of questions and some inquiries from the Native community because I sent this out to a number of individuals to make sure that they were involved in it or were able to access it. So that's the thing as far as the challenges. The good thing about all this, I think, is that this is system initiated. As much as we've all gone, those of us who work in the system have gone to the system and try to get things going and try to get some changes through the system, we were pretty much shut out. And subsequently, because of certain, political and social activities have been taking place, the system has initiated this, and that's a big plus. When the system says we want to change this, we want to develop some kind of diversity, we want to develop some kind of activity where, we've got some parity going with our community and working with our community so that we can change this and improve our conditions of the individuals who are participating in the judicial system. So thank you.
Chris, you get last word.
So this for me is not like a great challenge, but it's a challenge that actually was pointed out by one of the community members when we met last Friday. She talked about the fact that she realizes that we don't have enough male voices representing, people with lived experience, that, they have a lot of, they have heavy representation of women, but that men and women have different needs. And so it's really important to get some more men into the process so they can also share their concerns. She talked about, her husband, for example, and herself, they both have different needs in these spaces and, going through different challenges. So it's really important to have, enough male representation as well. But another thing I wanted to mention is, as a challenge is, having victims' voices and from community in these spaces as well. Want to make sure that we're hearing from everybody. I think we have a few that have been offenders as well as victims. But I was hoping that we can just get a victim's voice or victims' voices as well to just speak from those challenges. As we're trying to get everybody together, we know that this work is challenging, but we know we've come a long way. And another thing that I really admired about that group is the fact that they all were willing to, take responsibility for their, actions that led them to those offenses. And they're willing to do that. They took responsibilities, they all shared that, but they also talked about, the way forward. They talked about moving forward. How can we overcome some of the challenges that we're currently experiencing with the system? How can we work with the system to truly reform the system? So it makes it better, not just for us, but for others who are going through similar challenges.
Yeah. All right. Great. Well, I want to thank the panel for this part of the discussion. We have time for a few questions from the audience, and so some of these questions might be things that people who spoke prior might be able to answer. So I'd invite anyone else, the other folks who talked earlier, to also join us for Q&A. One of the first questions is, did Ramsey County Corrections take a position for or against limiting the maximum term of probation that can be imposed? And are there any findings about how long probation terms affect the rate of violations or types of violations? So, Corey, maybe you could address sort of what was going on in terms of length of probation in Ramsey County during this period.
Yeah, and I saw that question. I was because that was one of the first things that we looked at. I mean, we looked at the revocation rate and we looked at failure on probation, but a big part of it was probation term. And Leah and Ed can, I think it was around, when we started looking at this, around 67 or 68 months was the average person that was on probation. And that was part of the reason why we were leading to so many revocations, is because clients were on too long. And this may sound weird, but part of the problem is fabulous probation staff, probation officers that care about what happens to the community and the client and the victims. And we were filing violations that were legitimate, but we were having people that were on for 2, 3, 4, 5 years into it. And when you have clients that are struggling with chemical dependency and mental health issues, you will have a time when you have things are good for a while, things are bad for a while, up and down. And then if you file probation violations, legitimate probation violations during certain areas, all of a sudden we're in front of Judge Aligata on the 4th PV. it gets to be difficult as to what those discussions are. And that's what happens where we had led to a lot of revocations. So the first thing we looked at was the PSI unit they just recommended 5 years for almost all felonies. I don't think we ever really realized we could have recommended something else. So once we started looking at that and recommending 2 and 3 year increments, judges for the most part agreed, and the prosecutors as well have to agree on that. So once we started getting away from 5 years for everyone, and then we also legislative, it changed to 5 years a couple of years ago. We had clients that were on for first degree possession or sale that were on for 20 or 30 years. Even with early discharges, they were serving usually 6 or 7 years, even if things were going really, really well. So probation terms of what we did with that, Ed and Lee, I think we're down to about 44 months right now. So we've trimmed off about 20 months on the average person who's on probation. And everything we've looked at is if they're going to struggle and they're going to commit new crimes, it's usually within that first year or 18 months. Once you get past that point, most of the time they've handled their conditions, they're doing well. There's not a lot of purpose in that extra year or two. So that's been a huge aspect of this whole reducing revocation challenge.
Great. And I was just also gonna, well, actually you said the point that I was gonna add. Is there anything else, Lily, did you want to?
Yes, in fact, I could share a bonus slide with you for time to violate. So that is something, I actually took this slide out for presentation, so I'm excited the question came up because now I can show my bonus slide. So you see here that violations do tend to occur within the first year. In fact, within the first few months, we see a lot. A lot of those violations are from people who didn't show up to their probation officer in the first place. And that might seem like something that, we can't do anything but there's been a lot of discussion about if the probation officer is making a connection with people right away. So are they in the court? Are they actually talking to them, or is the person just expected to figure that out? But we see a pretty big drop off after that first year in violations. So we are seeing more issues at the beginning. And I think that's really important to know that timing and think about when we should kind of think about when our intervention should be occurring. And from what I can tell from the reports from other states, this is something that we're seeing pretty similarly across a lot of locations, that when people violate, it's generally going to become apparent pretty quickly that's going to occur. But interviews also did indicate that sometimes they'll violate near the end of probation just because someone hasn't finished programs and they kind of wait until the end to do all of the violations at once. So we kind of see a couple of patterns, but for the most part, we're seeing violations occur near the beginning of their probation term.
Thanks. So another question we have is, to what extent are standard probation terms proposed by prosecutors, questioned, evaluated by judges to determine the appropriateness to defendant? And I think they're talking about conditions here. It says here, for example, is probation on use of alcohol imposed even if the individual does not have a problem with misuse? So Judge Allegata, I'm just kind of wondering if you could just talk briefly about that process and how those conditions can be set.
Absolutely. Typically a person that, let's just say, has pled guilty to an offense that requires a PSI, a sentence investigation, probation officer who writes that report will typically recommend which standard and special conditions should be imposed by the court. Our Ramsey County probation officers will typically tie any probation officer to a specific need of the client. And so that specific question, alcohol abstinence or controlled substance abstinence and testing, will typically be recommended only for somebody that has a substance use disorder. That said, this is part of the conversations that we've been having about whether conditions are tailored to the person's needs, therefore to, hopefully prevent recidivism. We're trying to be really thoughtful and actually look at the data and make sure that when probation conditions are being imposed, that they're tailored to a specific person. One of the issues here is saving resources, making sure that people that have risks, certain risks have conditions that are imposed, and people that don't have those risks don't have those conditions imposed, because there's a limited number of resources that can go around. So that's a really good question. And the best answer is we are trying to make sure that this is a priority in terms of what we do with people on probation, is tailored conditions.
Thanks. Well, We have more questions, but unfortunately we have reached the end of our time today as well. We will be posting this recording online. We will also post the slides online, so you can return to these again in the future if you want to. I really want to thank all of the presenters today. This was absolutely fantastic. I really enjoyed talking to all of you today and hearing everything that we've learned and what were the steps that are being taken on this project. Thanks everyone for coming today, and have a wonderful afternoon.